Hi, Matt, and everybody who's tuned into Our Soil. My name's David Montgomery. I'm happy to be here talking with you about a series of books that I've written. I'm a geologist who's been very interested in the issues of soil and degradation and soil health for a number of years now. And I want to basically take advantage of the time to share with you some of my thoughts that I've developed in concert with Anne Baclay, my wife and biologist, who is unfortunately not able to be with us here today as I record this talk. But I'm going to go through stuff we've been working on together for a while, and so let me get going here with the basic idea of where we're going to start. And I have written this series of 4 books, the most recent being What Your Food Ate, which looks at how to connect the problem of soil health to crop health, livestock health, and human health. What are the connections that weave those things together? That book is an outgrowth of research that we've done in previous books. Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization, that looked at how the way people have treated land throughout history have affected the way the land has treated societies throughout history. The Hidden Half of Nature, it was a deep dive into the world of microbial ecology and its effects on soil health and the parallels with what goes on in the soil and in the human gut that Anne and I wrote together. The Growing Revolution is more of a how-to book about regenerative agriculture, about how farmers around the world are able to put the science in the hidden half of nature to work solving the problems I wrote about in Dirt. And What Your Food Ate, the most recent book that'll try and weave it all together today, is really looking at the consequences for human health, not just at a societal level, but even on our personal level in terms of what is actually getting into the food that we all eat and how our farming practices affect that. So the way to, I'll just, in trying to summarize 4 books in a few minutes here, I'll go fairly quickly through some of the key points. In Dirt, the main point I was trying to make is that societies that don't take care of their soil really don't last. It's one of the key lessons of history that really comes through when you look at the soils in different societies around the world and how they've changed over time. And soil erosion and degradation, it turns out, have played a key role in limiting the lifespan of many past societies around the world. Soil erosion is not just a problem of ancient history, it's a problem that plagues the planet today in a fairly big way. If we look at the UN's Global State of the Soil Assessment from 2015, they concluded that humanity loses another 0.3% of our global food production capacity each and every year due to ongoing soil erosion and degradation. At that pace, we were on track to lose more than a quarter of our ability to feed ourselves on this planet over the course of this century as our population continues to grow. Soil erosion degradation is not just a problem of ancient history, but it did start a long time ago. The invention of the plow really dramatically increased rates of soil erosion on lands that society after society have used to feed themselves. How does that work? Well, a plow inverts the soil, it leaves the ground bare and vulnerable to erosion by water or by wind, and that can greatly accelerate the pace of soil loss to be many times higher than the pace of soil building. There's estimates today that pace of soil loss exceed paces of soil building by a factor of 10 to 100, because modern agriculture is losing an inch of soil in about 20 years. That's a number that came out of a compilation study that I did a number of years ago that looked at rates of soil erosion on farms all around the world. And on average, they lose about 1 millimeter of soil a year. That's not a hugely fast number by any stretch of the imagination, unless you're a geologist, in which case it's extremely, screamingly fast. Why? Because nature builds soils at a much slower pace. It takes nature 500 to 1,000 years to replace that inch of topsoil that modern farming can erode off in just a couple decades. And that problem plagued ancient societies as well, and continues to plague us today through the problem of soil loss. But soil degradation also includes the loss of soil organic matter. This journal article that came out in 2015 in the journal Sustainability on North American soil degradation concluded that the soil organic matter content of many soils across North America is only about 50%, only about half of the level they were at the time when they were first converted from forests or prairie lands to farmlands. That 50% number is actually a pretty good number for global soil degradation as well. We've run down the agricultural batteries of our planet by about half, by burning through half the soil organic matter greatly through 2 key processes that are sort of bedrock features of modern conventional farming. That's heavy routine tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Heavy routine tillage can lead to a loss of the topsoil, and most of the organic matter is in the topsoil, so you're losing the best stuff off the top. So erosion can be very damaging to soil fertility and soil production. Um, and synthetic nitrogen fertilizers tend to stimulate bacterial life in the soil that breaks down the organic matter in the soil, and that can leave farmers dependent on chemical fertilizers to provide the fertility needed to maintain high yields going forward once the topsoil is lost and the organic matter is degraded. So these two key elements of modern farming practices, intense routine tillage and routine agrochemical use, are two factors that have greatly impacted the health of agricultural soils around the world, and not for the better. So one of the conclusions I came to one of the questions I came to, in researching dirt was, can we actually reverse the historical pattern of soil erosion and degradation that so plagued past societies? And if so, how fast could we do it? Could we do it fast enough to be sort of relevant in a policy world, and relevant to addressing some of the main problems that humanity faces in the 21st century? And I'm delighted to report that I think we can, and I think we can do it relatively fast, actually screamingly fast from a geological perspective. But to do so, we'd have to start thinking about the soil differently in the way that we farm, and indeed we'd have to start farming differently, not in the manner that we call conventional farming today. So how did Ann and I start to look into what was going on in the soil in terms of life in the soil that led to writing The Hidden Half of Nature, that explored the microbial roots of life and health? Well, in that book, we conclude that symbiotic microbial allies really support the health of plants and animals, including people. That the whole notion of cooperation as opposed to competition has actually been an under-recognized element of biological evolution, literally since land plants first started colonizing the continents. And The Hidden Half of Nature is a deep exploration of how that works between microorganisms and their host organisms. So the soil life and plants, or what's happening in the human gut. Because soil life, it turns out, acts very similarly to what happens to with our own microbiome in our own gut. We've all probably heard a lot in the last few years about how our microbiome, the microbes that are living within us, and particularly in our colon, in the lower part of our digestive tract, are really central to supporting our immune system, that affect our moods, that affect our health in many ways, and that what we eat affects what they are able to make in our gut that end up turning out affecting our health. And plants have a microbiome as well. They have trillions of tiny helpers that are in the soil that they recruit to help them with meeting their health requirements, and in ways that Ann and I explored in writing The Hidden Half of Nature. How did we start getting into this? Well, we did it it started when we bought a house in Seattle, and Ann, being the biologist, really wanted to have a garden, and me being the geologist, I was like, I was thinking, oh, well, we've got a nice side yard that should be a perfect place. Neither one of us thought to dig a soil pit in the yard when we bought the house, and when we pulled the scrappy lawn off that had covered the side yard, we realized we had really crappy soil. There was hardly any organic matter. It's this khaki dirt. There wasn't a single worm that crawled out of it when we cleared that topsoil off. And being the biologist, decided that we needed to essentially restore that soil adding biology. We had all the mineral matter that we needed for healthy soil. What we were lacking was organic matter and life in the soil. So with a decade-long program of composting and mulching and bringing organic matter in from everywhere she could find it, in what we came to term her organic matter crusade, she was able to convert this 1 to 2% organic matter soil that we started with on my right hand there, on the left hand side of the screen, into the stuff that's there today. It's more like about 8 to 10% organic matter, greatly increasing the fertility of the land. There's led to a beautiful garden with an explosion of life and all kinds of animal and insect life and bird life that came back once the soil was restored and the plant life was restored. And we started really thinking about and researching what is it that was going on in our soil as a result of all this intensive compost and mulching that was leading to such a dramatic change and soil building over the course of just a few years, building soil faster than we would think that nature would normally take to build it, and restoring fertility to our lot in basically a decade, not the centuries that it would take nature to rebuild soil from scratch. And that led us to the world of the rhizosphere, which is literally Greek for the zone around the roots of a plant. And the exudates that plants exude into the soil from their roots. Now, I was trained in graduate school to think of roots as straws that suck up nutrients from the soil, nutrients and water from the soil to basically combine with the carbon captured through photosynthesis to build the botanical bodies. But it turns out that roots are more like two-way highways, where exudates are what's leaving and the water and the nutrients are coming in. And so what are in exudates? Well, carbohydrates, fats, proteins. What does that sound like? Sounds a lot like food, doesn't it? Plants are exuding food out into the soil, and many plants will exude, a quarter to up to a third or more of the carbon that they capture through photosynthesis. They'll exude that out through their roots into the soil. And in the soil, those exudates feed soil life, and the life that they're feeding is not pests and pathogens, but plants are recruiting helpers, things that do things that benefit the plants, that are seed, the exudates are essentially the currency that this underground biological bazaar around the roots of a plant, it uses to essentially recruit symbiotic partners from the microbial world that partner with the plants to promote the health of both plant and the microbial community. So if you blow up the area around a root hair in the soil, you have this root coming down through here, plants are releasing exudates out into the soil, and all these little red microbes are consuming those exudates. Exudates only make it about a millimeter to a centimeter away from a root or root hair before something consumes it. And what does anything do with stuff that they consume? Biological organisms metabolize things. They change one thing into another and harvest energy or nutrients or whatever they're getting from that particular molecule out of it. And when Ann and I started finding research papers that were documenting how plants were exuding compounds into the soil that certain bacteria would consume, and that those bacterial metabolites would be plant growth promoting hormones that the plant would then take back up through its roots, because it was happening right around the root zone, and use that to grow bigger, capture more solar energy, produce more exudates, feed more bacteria. It was very obvious that these are an example of a positive feedback, a synergistic relationship of mutual benefit to both the microbes and the plant. And fungi in the soil have forge similar kinds of partnerships with plants. The fungi, mycorrhizal fungi in particular, will send their fungal hyphae out to penetrate roots and root hairs, and then off on the other end out into the soil to basically penetrate soil particles and grab things like copper or zinc or phosphorus out of the soil, bring that back and trade it to the plant for a cut of those sugary exudates. These mutually beneficial relationships turn out to be an organizing principle in the world of relationships between microbial life and their host organisms. And what we've been learning about that in the last several decades in particular has really reshaped how we should be thinking about both agriculture and medicine through these microbial partnerships. For example, we can think about soils as plants now as having two fairly different kinds of diets. What Ann and I in the Hidden Half of Nature call the fertilizer diet, where you can you can get high yields of biomass from plants growing in fairly poor soil, carbon poor soil, organic matter poor soil. If you add enough N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, to the soil, you can grow large yields of biomass in even fairly poor soils. But those plants don't tend to invest as much in their root system. They don't tend to invest as much in producing exudates. Why? Because they're living the free good life, where they're basically getting what they need to grow big without putting in the effort to recruit microbial partners in the soil. So they then suffer from not having as many beneficial microbial metabolites or as many many micronutrients that those microbial organisms would be providing from the soil. In contrast, plants growing in healthy, fertile soil, the rich in organic matter and soil life, will invest a lot in their root system, invest a lot in exudates, and in return, they get a share of beneficial micronutrients and beneficial microbial metabolites, and they don't need anywhere near the kind of levels of additional nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium to achieve comparable yields because they're growing in healthy, fertile soils. They also are their defensive systems are better teed up. Their health, crop health, is higher in healthy soils, and we think it's no coincidence that the global sales of synthetic pesticides went through the roof following global adoption of widespread synthetic fertilizer use, because we essentially disarmed the natural defensive systems of our crops. Why? Well, because those micronutrients that microbes help to get into plants, including our crops, include things like iron, zinc, and selenium, things that are crucial for botanical health, also elements that are crucial for our health, for human health, that we and plants don't need in huge amounts. I mean, zinc is a fairly specialized element that is good in enzymes, and we need it to promote our own health, but we don't need that much of it. And it turns out the microbial world really helps serve as root extensions for plants to get those elements into crops. And we can't, for example, eat copper. We can't eat pennies to get our copper. We need to consume copper, but we need plants to eat the copper out of rocks first and process it into organic material that we can then take in for our nutrition. So the microbial life in the soil helps provision micronutrients for plants, and they also help provision what are known as phytochemicals, plant-made chemicals, in other words, that help plants with their communication purposes, with defense and protection purposes. You think about how plants communicate with one another. They don't have a language that we recognize. They speak a chemical language through chemical exudates and the things that they take up from the soil. That's how they're exchanging information with their environment and with their allies in the soil. And for defense purposes, phytochemicals can actually serve to help repel particular insect pests. There's examples, for example, in which an insect pest will nibble on the vegetation of a plant. That plant will then respond by sending out phytochemicals into the soil, exudates into the soil that recruit particular microbes that will then metabolize those exudates into compounds that, when the plant takes them back up, it spurs the plant to produce phytochemicals that repel that particular insect pest. In other words, there's these incredibly intricate and highly evolved partnerships between microbial communities and plants that help to bolster plant defenses, but also provide nourishment for the microbes, and they can help provide protection for plants too. Some phytochemicals, like the beta carotene that colors carrots and squashes, that orangish color, that's a really good UV blocker. So it's essentially a sunscreen that can help provide protection for crops. Now, plants don't take on phytochemicals to benefit our health, but many phytochemicals actually end up serving antioxidant and anti-inflammatory purposes once they get into our bodies. So the processes through which plants make phytochemicals can track through to influencing the healthfulness of the foods that make it into the human diet. But this biological bazaar in the soils, with these mutually beneficial relationships between microbial life and plants, are really nature's health plan for both soils and crops. So building healthy soils helps to maintain healthy crops. And that's something that I looked at in researching Growing Our Evolution. As in writing The Hidden Half of Nature, Anne and I dove deep into the world of microbial ecology, but it was on a lot in an urban setting where we had sources of organic matter we could import from the Starbucks, down the street, where we could get their coffee grounds after hours for use in fertilizing the yard, or we could get composted herbivore manure from the Seattle Zoo. So I wanted to ask myself the question of how feasible is it to actually use the kind of science that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature to rebuild the fertility of fully economically viable farms in different parts of the world. So I took about 6 months off from teaching at the University of Washington, where I teach, to visit farmers around the world who had restored fertility to their farms in much the same way that Anne restored fertility to our yard, and looked at how they did it. And I came away convinced that regenerative farming can restore soil fertility remarkably fast, like in decades, a decade or two being remarkably fast. And that regenerative farming and ranching could put a whole lot of carbon back in the ground and turn degraded land into very fertile land in fairly short order. And how to do that? Well, we ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. Go to no-till or low-till, minimal physical disturbance, minimize chemical disturbance, cover the soil with cover crops when a cash crop isn't being grown, and growing a diversity of plants in the soil. That recipe was really the recipe for building healthy, fertile soils. And the real difference here is thinking about the emphasis that conventional agriculture places on chemistry as the sort of the foundation for soil fertility, and thinking about how regenerative agriculture emphasizes cultivating soil life as the foundation for fertility and productive agriculture. And that represents sort of a sea change in thinking in terms of our basic philosophy of agriculture that leads to some very important different operating principles for how to optimize soil health and achieve a truly regenerative and productive agriculture. And there's three principles that I found that were shared in common by farmers, whether they were on subsistence farms in Central West Africa and Central America, or across North America on highly mechanized North American commodity crop farms. The farmers that had been very successful at rebuilding the fertility of their land adopted practices that followed the three key principles of minimizing disturbance, so minimizing physical and chemical disturbance to go to either low or no-till practices and reduce and minimize the use of agrochemicals. They always kept their soil covered through cover crops when they were not growing cash crops, and they planted diverse crop rotations, that recipe of three that I mentioned in terms of ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. And by diverse crop rotations, I mean not growing just corn and soybeans year after year in the same fields, but having 5 or 6 crops that rotate through is a great way to actually reduce pest and pathogen problems. And there's a fourth principle that many of the regenerative farmers I visited have employed, but not all of them, and that's to reintegrate animal husbandry into their cropping operations, to get manure back into their fields as a way to accelerate the breakdown of crop residues and return fertility to the land in short order. Now, it turns out that when you think about why these principles would actually work, particularly those first three, it's a recipe for cultivating beneficial life in the soil. Don't disturb them, feed them with cover crops, and give them a diverse community to work with. It's a recipe for cultivating the beneficial partners that crops are naturally inclined to recruit in the soil. And that also happens to be roughly the opposite of how we've taught people to farm for the last 100 years in conventional farming, with our reliance on routine mechanized tillage and agrochemicals for feeding crops and for pest control, and for specializing in 1 or 2 crops in a field. This is a whole different way of thinking about the problem of how to go about defining what your practices are in agriculture. And those general principles translate to different settings around the world. I found they were operative wherever I went, but the specific practices are not. The farmers that were farming in equatorial Africa, for example, used very different technology, equipment, and crops, and in a different climate with totally different soils than farmers in the American Midwest. The specific practices in regenerative farming need to be tailored to the specific setting, even to particular places on a farm. But those general principles of minimizing chemical and physical disturbance, keeping the ground covered with cover crops, and growing a diversity of crops translate right across, and they really work. This shows you an example of soils from David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio, where back in the early 1970s he started farming. When he first went to no-till, he had soil that looked like this khaki, this hard-baked khaki clod over there on the right. And by the time I visited him in 2015 to write Growing a Revolution, David had turned that soil into this rich, dark chocolate cake. And the difference in color is organic matter. And organic matter is 58% carbon. Nature invented a beautiful way to capture carbon from the atmosphere and park it underground where it can do us some good rather than causing us problems in the sky. And that's called photosynthesis. And it's those exudates that plants are dripping out of their roots to feed microbial life, that then those microbes their dead bodies become a lot of that soil organic matter that can change fairly fast if we change our farming practices. You can take just a couple decades to turn this khaki stuff into that really dark stuff. The one other farmer whose soils I'll show you is Gabe Brown, a rancher and farmer in Bismarck, North Dakota, operates, who has been started off a no-till and then went to diverse cover crops and has become a fairly prominent regenerative farmer. This shows you his market garden plot where he's been reintegrating animal husbandry, both his cows and chickens, onto the fields where the cows graze off the cover crops, the chickens graze off the things that pop up in the cow pies, and he's able to sell not only vegetables at the farmer's market, but also meat and eggs. And what has that done to his soil? Well, the cattle, by consuming his cover crop stubble and then manuring the field, are accelerating the breakdown and the cycling of organic matter in the soil. And this shows you what Gabe's been able to do in converting the soil that was like his neighbors over here in his left hand down low into the soil from that field I just showed you, where he reintroduced his livestock to the field. And you have a soil that's incredibly deep, rich, black soil. He's basically been able to restore the soil on his farm over the course of just a couple decades. Where back in the early 1990s, when he started with no-till farming, he had about 2% organic matter in his soil and about a 3 inches of topsoil. By 2010, after he had introduced cash crop diversity and integrated cover crops and then multi-species covers, gradually ratcheting up his adherence to those 3 principles I laid out earlier, and finally to the point of livestock integration, he basically tripled his organic matter content from 1.7% to 6.1%. His topsoil depth had gone from 3 inches to 14 inches. He'd rebuilt the fertility across his whole farm in just a couple decades in ways that enabled him to completely wean himself off of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and increase his crop yields, and in a way such that he has a more profitable farm. And his experience is not unique. Claire Lacan and Jonathan Lundgren wrote a paper in 2018 in the journal Peer J, where they compared the economics of regenerative and conventional corn production in the American Corn Belt. And the way you read this graph is that over the y-axis over here is revenue and cost per hectare for either conventional or regenerative corn farming. And I believe it was a comparison of 20 farms of each, if I'm remembering the numbers right. And the way you read it is the top of these bars is how much dollar value they harvested off of their fields on average. And you'll notice that the regenerative farmers harvested about $500 an acre more than their conventional neighbors. Not per acre, per hectare than their conventional neighbors. And then if you look at profit, it's the white bar that's left at the bottom after you take what they made and subtract off all the things they spent for corn seeds and crop insurance, herbicide, irrigation. You'll notice there's less expenses on the regenerative farms. These were not organic farmers. They were still using some agrochemicals, but they'd so greatly reduced the reliance on them that they were much more profitable because they in rebuilding the fertility of their soil, they managed to increase their crop yields, and they spent less money to actually maintain those crop yields than their conventional neighbors. That's a recipe for higher farmer profits. So on the list of benefits of healthy, fertile soils, I place higher farmer profits at the top of the list because I think that if you're going to sustain a farm and have a sustainable farm, you have to sustain the farm, not just the soil, not just the life in the soil, but the economic viability of the farm. And using less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel to harvest comparable yields is a recipe for a more profitable farm. How much less fertilizer, pesticide, and fossil fuel did these regenerative farmers I visited use? Well, across the board, pretty much, they cut their fossil fuel use by at least half. And they also reduced their fertilizer and pesticide use by at least that much, and sometimes up to about 90%. Very meaningful savings. But there's other benefits to society as well that come from the benefits of healthy soil. Healthy soil has more carbon in it, and that carbon came out of the atmosphere. The healthy soils can hold more water, retain and hold more water. They provide greater drought resilience to a farm. And also, they produce less off-site pollution. The single best way to reduce the off-site pollution of nitrates and phosphates fouling our waterways and groundwater is to use less of them on farms in the first place. And that brings us to the fourth book, What Your Food Ate, which really focuses on the connection between soil health and human health. That connection is one in which we basically dove into trying to identify what are the connections, but how does soil health affect crop health? How does crop health affect livestock health? How does crop health and livestock health affect human health? And the research sort of connecting all the little dots that connect soil health all the way over to human health, like beads on a string, to try and figure out, well, what can we say about those influences? And we basically concluded that there's very solid evidence that farming practices affect the dietary levels of four key components of the human diet that are very much related to human health. And that is phytochemicals, which once they get into our bodies, function as antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. And then vitamins and minerals that are needed for health as well. Those are affected by farming practices, as well as the provisioning and the balance between the omega-3 and omega-6 fats, which very much relate to processes of inflammation that I'll talk about a little further near the end of the talk. And also microbial metabolites. It turns out that what our gut microbes make out of the foods that we eat depends to some degree on how those foods are actually grown. So in trying to compare the effects of regenerative and conventional farming on what the nutrient density of what gets onto our plates, one of the studies that Ann and I conducted was a 10 adjacent paired farm comparison across the U.S., from California over to Connecticut, where we had adjacent regenerative and conventional farms grow the same crop in the same kind of soil in the same year, and we compared what was in those crops and also how healthy the soil was on these farms. Now, these regenerative farms had been practicing regenerative farming for between 5 and 10 years with that full combination of minimal disturbance, cover crops, and diversity. And you'll notice that the soil organic matter content in this little box and whiskers plot on the left, the average is about twice what it was on the regenerative farms, is about twice what it was on the conventional farms. Essentially reversing that historical pattern of loss that we talked about that characterized North American farmland soils earlier in the talk. In terms of soil health scores, the regenerative farms scored 3 times higher on the Haney soil health score test across the board. So the regenerative farms were successful, very much so, at rebuilding the fertility of their soil. What did it do to what was in their food? Well, that was, it's a little more all over the map in terms of, as you might imagine, the geology of different places all over the U.S. are really different. So the results in terms of minerals depended a bit on where you were. But in terms of phytochemicals across the board, carotenoids, phenolics, and phytosterols were up by about 20%. Certain vitamins were up between about 15 and 30%, between about a sixth and a third higher in the regenerative crops. But in other words, there's some real evidence that these regenerative practices on growing the same crop in the same soil with different soil qualities, different soil health levels, same basic soil type, but different soil health, really matters to what gets into our food. And there's another element of how regenerative farming practices can actually influence our food, and that comes through another biological bazaar, the rumen of ruminants. The amazing digestive apparatus of the cow, centered on the rumen. It's another biological bazaar. It's a microbial ecosystem that transforms whatever the cow eats into the stuff that actually the cow takes up as nourishment that powers the cow. And it turns out that what cows eat has a huge effect on the amount and ratio of omega-3 and omega-6 fats in the meat and dairy that they produce when translated into our diet. Now, a livestock that eats a 100% grass-fed diet is going to have meat and milk that's full of omega-3 fats. Why is that? Because omega-3 fats are involved in photosynthesis. So the green parts of plants are full of omega-3s. And so, 100% grass-fed meat and dairy is going to be rich in omega-3s. In contrast, seed-based feeds, the kind of feeds that animals get in confined feeding operations, are rich in omega-6s. And a diet that is basically based on seed-based concentrates, rumen is going to be their diet will be overloaded with omega-6 fats. Why are seeds full of omega-6s? because omega-6s are a more stable kind of fat. They're perfectly suited for what they need to do in seeds. But there's this basic difference in a cow's diet as to whether they're getting an overload of omega-6s or ample omega-3s. And it turns out that when you look at the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the human diet, in our meat and dairy in particular, it's gone from being a rough balance to just a factor of 2 or 3 out, with more omega-6s than omega-3s historically, which is roughly the proportion of omega-6s to 3s one finds in wild game, which is not a coincidence. But then the modern diet, omega-6s outweigh omega-3s by 10, 20, 30 to 1 due to the prevalence of seed oils in processed foods, and also that our meat and dairy is now primarily seed-based feed fed. Sorry, for that mouthful. But what our food ate in terms of meat and dairy has greatly changed in the last few decades, to the point where we're now awash in omega-6s versus omega-3s in our diet. And the amount of phytochemicals that we're getting from meat and dairy has also changed in our food. Stephen Van Vliet and Fred Provenza and Scott Kronberg, in a paper a few years ago, compiled 22 studies that they reviewed that compared the effects of a pasture versus concentrated diet on the phytochemicals that are in meat and dairy. And they found that carotenoids, tocopherols, or vitamin E's, polyphenols, terpenoids, they all were at least 2 to 20-fold higher in grass-fed meat and milk than they were in conventionally fed meat and dairy products. And again, this goes back to what the livestock were eating. Conventionally CAFO-raised meat and dairy that are primarily fed off of seed-derived feeds are going to be rich in omega-6s. 100% grass-fed meat and dairy is going to be much richer in omega-3s than conventional. In other words, what the cows eat translates right over into the human diet for those of us who eat meat and dairy products. And this is, conceivably a part of what has helped to drive a big change in public health across the westernized world in the last 50 years or so. The incidence of infectious diseases have greatly decreased over the years. And you can chalk that up to vaccines, better sanitation, water, better sanitary water supplies. There's a whole host of things that one can look at as having reduced the incidence of infectious diseases up to the point that COVID kind of tipped the apple cart over. But the influence of immune disorders and chronic illnesses rooted in chronic inflammation in ways that connect to diet have been increasing greatly over that same time period. Our great-grandparents, worried about diseases that we hardly even know the names of anymore. And we are now to the point where something like 7 out of 10 people in the United States die from a chronic disease that's rooted in inflammation and diet. This is sort of the modern health crisis, is much more one of chronic inflammation than one of infectious diseases. And what's the connections between inflammation and diet? Well, it turns out if we look at inflammation as a process, you want inflammation to be able to initiate. You want it to, if your body needs to fight off a disease or a pathogen, you want inflammation to come to the rescue, but you want it to turn off when it's done its job. So certain fats start and maintain inflammation, and other fats act to end inflammation. And once inflammation starts, you don't want it to stay. You don't want it to stay on. That leads to chronic inflammation. You want it to resolve and to terminate. And it turns out that it's omega-6 fats that are mostly involved in the initiating and maintaining inflammation, and it's omega-3 fats that are involved in the resolution phase of inflammation. So in shifting our diet from one that was fairly balanced in terms of omega-3s and 6s, so you have the ability to start and stop inflammation as your body needs it. Now that our bodies are awash in omega-6 fats, we're really good at initiating inflammation and not as good at terminating it. And that has had health consequences for many people in the westernized world. And if we look at phytochemicals as another a big dietary change that's happened as we've gone from landed in what we now think of as a conventional farming world. Sources of phytochemicals are fruits and vegetables are dominant sources. Meat and dairy can also be good sources if the cattle were actually eating a diverse set of plants full of phytochemicals in the first place, and no, seeds don't tend to be full of them. So the foods that we eat, that once they go down the hatch and drop down into our digestive tract and into our colon, the human microbiome takes over. And the human microbiome is another case of microbial metabolites. The human microbiome will take the fiber in the foods that we've been eating that the phytochemicals tend to be wrapped up in, or the fats, and they will metabolize those into metabolites that have anti-cancer properties or anti-diabetic properties, anti-inflammation properties that support brain health or cardiac health. It's another case of really medicinal microbial metabolites that depend on the phytochemicals being in the foods we eat in the first place. So the farming practices that reduce the amount of phytochemicals in our food are basically reducing the ability of our microbiome to provide for us things that help to keep our bodies running smoothly, especially in terms of antioxidants, anti-cancer compounds, and anti-inflammation compounds, or anti-inflammatories. So in the end, what we concluded in writing What Your Food Ate, after this deep dive into the medical world and the agricultural world, is fairly simple after all. What's good for the land is good for us too. People have recognized this since the 1930s, at least, in the early days of organic agriculture, making the case for how soil health equates to crop health, livestock health, and human health. But there's a ton of peer-reviewed literature now that's been published in the last 40, 50 years, and much of it in the last couple of decades, that fills in how it actually works, so that we now understand some of the reasons behind how our farming practices can great impact our what's in our diet, and why we should be thinking of agricultural policies really as health policies for a populace at large. So I'll basically stop there. I obviously recommend all 4 books for anyone who's interested in these subjects. If you're really interested in the connections to human health and policy, I'd start with What Your Food Ate. It's the capstone book that looks at how these things all go together. If you're interested in history, I'd recommend Dirt. If you're really interested in microbial ecology, I'd recommend The Hidden Half of Nature. And if you want to know more about the how-to of regenerative farming and read stories of farmers around the world who've been very successful at rebuilding the fertility of their land, Growing a Revolution might be a place to start. You can read them in any order that you want. I'm a little biased, but I obviously recommend them all to you. I've learned a lot in researching these, as has Anne, and we look forward to continuing to work on this stuff in the future, and I'll probably leave it there. And Matt, thank you for helping to educate people about the importance of soil and soil health. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done.